Hello and welcome to Josiah is Right. When you're a kid, everyone tells you what to do. From teachers to advertising executives to the government, everyone wants to tell you, the kid, what to do.
They'll say, he's Josiah, a YouTuber.
He's Josiah, the YouTuber.
Trust me, as a parent, I spend most of my time telling my kids what to do.
Say, he's Josiah.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 80s, the golden era of the PSA. This was thanks to a combination of deregulation, so I guess the government not telling you what to do, and what we'll call moral responsibility, or maybe more accurately, guilt. Regardless of the why, as I already stated, the 1980s were the golden era of the PSA, because it was the golden era of action figures. The PSA, or Public Service Announcement, date back to, well, pretty much as long as there was information to give people. But for our purposes, the purposes of YouTube, it goes back to World War II. PSA is not YouTube. YouTube's newer than that. But not according to my kids. It's been around forever. The War Advertising Council, later the Ad Council, was set up in 1941, and really it was the propaganda arm of the government. Not only did the Duck brothers, Donald and Daffy, fight Nazis, but Bugs Bunny and Captain America sold us war bonds. Some of that may have happened in the MCU, but I'm not really sure where the MCU ends and reality begins. Or vice versa. Jumping ahead 40 years, which makes me realize 1980 is as far away from now as 1940 was from 1980. Give or take a year. And now we need to introduce the key players, who include that deregulating president who smoked in World War II training videos, and I assume sold war bonds with Captain America. We'll get back to Reagan in a bit, but first his adversary in this situation, Action for Children's Television. ACT first formed in the late 1960s to do battle with, of all things, Romper Room for trying to get kids to buy toys. In this case, the Boston area station on which Romper Room aired caved in. They soon battled Space Ghost and other violent cartoons of the day. So horrifying to watch. ACT was kind of against kids buying stuff in general and really them experiencing any kind of joy. ACT felt kids couldn't distinguish between an advertisement and reality. I personally still can't. I'm not even sure if this is part of the MCU or not. In the 1970s, they asked the FCC to entirely ban advertising to children along with a list of other demands. At the time, they held the first national symposium on children and television with Fred Rogers as the keynote speaker. Say it ain't so, Fred.
I think that it's much more dramatic that two men could be working out their feelings of anger. Much more dramatic than showing something of gunfire.
I mean, he was probably right.
For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
I think it's wonderful.
A few years later, the National Broadcasters Association conceded to ACT's demands. You could say it was a slam dunk for the NBA.
Not NBA.
What do you know, kid?
Everything.
Anyway, they compromised. That compromise included a limit of 12 minutes per hour that they could advertise to children. ACT was on a roll and continued to ramp things up until Ronald Reagan was all about deregulation, and he appointed Mark Fowler as chairman of the FCC. This deregulation, it led to everything that divided me and my fellow 80s kids. I'm sorry, Mr. Rogers. Oh, so sorry. It just occurred to me that us 80s kids, we're deeply conflicted by our very nature. Our mentors were Optimus Prime and Mr. Rogers. If those two could hash it out, I think they'd really get along.
I'd just like to talk about it. We don't have to bop somebody over the head.
Do not grieve.
To make drama.
Soon, I shall be one with the Matrix.
You've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you.
So, what was the first show masquerading as a toy commercial?
And the Masters of the Universe!
With the show's violence and the fact that it was pretty much built to sell toys, ACT was not a fan. Erica Scheimer, daughter of Lou, I am Filmation Scheimer, put it this way. Even before the show hit the air, the interest groups, heard about the title and started complaining about the violence in the show. However, Lou Scheimer and Filmation wanted the property for its cartoon potential. The younger Scheimer said, "Mattel put no money into the development of it. My dad made it very clear to them that we were going to finance the show. We were going to get it on the air, and he wasn't going to allow them to tell him what toys we had to put in." So, from Filmation's point of view, it wasn't about the guilt of being a 30-minute toy commercial. It was about the idea of this perceived violence. All this brings us to the aforementioned idea of guilt or moral responsibility. With the Wild West deregulated 80s, these shows pretty much could do what they wanted. Theoretically, they could have been super violent and sold you as many toys as they wanted. Imagine G.I. Joe with bullets instead of lasers. Oh, that was the comics. In the face of this deregulation, ACT was doing their darndest to reinforce that list of demands. So the operative word here is probably appeasement. Hasbro, Mattel, LJN, and so on were trying to appease these groups.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
Exactly. They just wanted them to shut up. Fowler became the FCC chairman in May 1981, and it took a minute for the toy companies to catch up with their newfound freedom. The first show to punch you in the face with its overt, awesome, and direct connection to Aisle 7 at Toys R Us.
And the Masters of the Universe!
He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was a breakthrough. As they dumped toys into those Toys R Us stores, they dumped episodes into syndication, one of the first animated shows to do this. With each of the 65 original episodes airing daily during the week, a second dump of 65 more episodes coming a year later. I was only a toddler, but I toddled over to the TV in time for He-Man, which I did pretty much for the first 10 years of my life. He-Man would go on to be one of the most watched shows, not just in my personal history, but in television history. And with all those episodes and all those kids watching, why not try to have some kind of positive message, right? Tons of 80s shows had such PSAs, the most famous of which has to be G.I. Joe. I mean, we all learned how to properly handle a nosebleed thanks to G.I. Joe. Also, those PSAs are why I don't do drugs. I mean, who needs drugs when you have cartoons like this, right? There were actually PSAs produced for Transformers, but never released. Granted, they were all ones previously used on G.I. Joe and Jem and the Holograms.
And knowing is half the battle.
The Transformers!
They had some for boys, girls, and transforming robot enthusiasts. Or would have, but didn't. But what was the very first 80s show with PSAs of this nature?
And the Masters of the Universe!
Remember what Erica Scheimer said about what she called the do-gooders of public interest groups? In the event you don't, it's currently on the screen. Basically, they wanted to shut those people up. The result was bringing in Scheimer's own professor from Stanford, Don Roberts, to act as an educational consultant and help with those PSAs and the overall pro-social nature of the episodes. We didn't really, and we won't touch on it much here, but being pro-social was a very big deal in 70s cartoons. Erica Scheimer said, "When people came around and claimed that He-Man was no good and didn't value any value, we could point out the fact that we had an educational consultant from Stanford. This isn't a totally uncommon occurrence. If you look at the MPAA or the long-defunct Comics Code Authority, it's the practice of a group self-regulating to prevent outside or government regulation. So what made the He-Man PSAs unique? It was the fact that, quite frankly, they weren't just PSAs. They may have covered an issue a G.I. Joe-like PSA would cover, but they were often epilogues to contextualize the episode, which the G.I. Joe ones were definitely not.
Today, He-Man was forced to play a dangerous game.
Watching He-Man as a 5-year-old and then a 10-year-old is a very different experience because you see the action and or violence very differently. You have more of a contextual understanding of what's going on. To that effect, Erica Scheimer said, "There's a difference between violence and action. I can assure you, my 4-year-old and 2-year-old see things very differently from one another. A hug for one becomes a sleeper hold for the other." The He-Man PSAs also broke the fourth wall with the show's characters in character talking directly to the audience.
In today's story, Elena tried taking a magic potion.
Sometimes they'd essentially tell you that what you just saw was fake, or at least imaginary. For me as a kid, These PSAs, although sometimes telling me what I saw wasn't really real, made the characters much more real. They became my friends, talking directly to me, and not just characters on an adventure I was disassociated from. To be fair, the deregulated nature of cartoons and their toy associations in the 80s kind of ran amok. It became an unwieldy beast of endless toy lines, fast food, video games, and sugary cereal. How was any of that bad? Anyway, it was glorious, but it inevitably had to come to an end. In 1988, Congress overwhelmingly passed a bill re-regulating our favorite cartoons. It reimposed the minutes of advertising and so forth. However, every 8-year-old's best friend, Ronnie Reagan, stepped in and vetoed it. Via a pocket veto. Basically, he didn't sign it while Congress was not in session, I think. Forgive me, AP government class was a long time ago, and I may have been sleeping at that time. Finally, in 1990, Congress passed the Children's Television Act, which limited commercial minutes, and put an outright ban on shows based on toy lines also having commercials for the toys from that show within the show itself. But He-Man was pretty much gone by then anyway, right? I said He-Man was gone! Well, I'm sure it was still on. They reran those 130 episodes as much as Filmation reused animation. Also, I had that toy as a kid, but I didn't realize it was supposed to be He-Man. Regardless, the restrictions that weren't there for pretty much the first 10 years of my life were back. In 1992, Action for Children's Television gathered on the roof of Abbey Road Studios, played a highly educational, commercial-free, and totally boring concert on the roof before disbanding. They'd achieved their goal. They blew up to Death Star twice. Only for grown men like me to form the first order of action figure collectors 30 years later. Some 90s shows, such as Captain Planet, used those 80s style PSAs. Mighty Max had PSAs much more in the vein of Masters of the Universe, giving historical context for each episode. By that point, they'd just gone out of fashion, and from a toy company societal optics point of view, they just weren't necessary anymore. No moral obligation, no guilt, nobody to shut up.
I know now why you cry.
So what's the moral of this story?
I just want to play.
I personally learned a lot from those PSAs, and I don't know about you, but I think that knowing is half the power? I don't know. I slept through that part of AP government. Today, we learned a great deal about PSAs. And PSAs are important, but above all we learned that YouTube videos about PSAs are boring. When in fact, the best part of this PSA was my kids fighting. Today, we learned a lot about PSAs. PSAs sometimes are kind of like being in class, and class can be boring, particularly math class. However, I don't endorse falling asleep. Never ever fall asleep in class. And in reality, I didn't fall asleep in class, but I have some friends that did. They were bad friends. And they're still my friends today. Today, as we learned about PSAs, we also saw tiny humans doing battle. And while it could be entertaining to watch kids get into fisticuffs, it's highly irresponsible. You should never encourage your children to fight, particularly not for the purposes of a YouTube video. And if they do get into a fight, make sure to pull them apart by the legs so you don't get bit. That might be dogs. Oh well. Remember, if you have money on the fight though, don't get involved. Let that thing ride out. Today, we learned a lot about PSAs, and my daughters pitched in. However, child labor should never be exploited. These kids work for free. So make sure your kids work for free. Then it's not exploitation. Right?